Which one should I play? What's going on, guys? I'm Jeff, the Yoshi Fanatic, and I love Yoshi's Woolly World. I've talked a lot about how I think it's one of the best games that the Yoshi series has to offer, but something I haven't talked a lot about is the 3DS version.
Yes, you heard me right. 3DS version of Yoshi's Woolly World. This actually used to be a pretty common practice for Nintendo. They'd make a game for their home console, and sometime down the line they'd port the game to one of their handheld consoles. This goes all the way back to the NES days, starting with porting the NES game Super Mario Bros. To the Game Boy Color as Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. If I had to guess, this is either to make up for poor sales on the original console, demonstrate the power of their shiny new handheld console, or just take advantage of the portable aspect of their handhelds. But regardless of the reason, it's a practice that continued up through the life of the 3DS, and Yoshi's Woolly World is one of the most recent examples. Nintendo released Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World on the 3DS in February of 2017, less than 2 years after the original 2015 Wii U release.
All things considered, it's actually a quite faithful port, and I think it's a good way to experience the game, but there are a number of things that set it apart from the original Wii U version, so that brings up an interesting question. Which version of Yoshi's Woolly World should you play?
Now, as I just mentioned, Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World is a very faithful reproduction of the original game. It has the same art style, music, world and level design, and gameplay mechanics. For the most part, it's the same game as the Wii U version, but there are definitely some changes that set it apart. First and most obvious, the 3DS is a much less powerful gaming device than the Wii U is, so the graphics had to be downgraded to accommodate the weaker hardware. The resolution was cut from a full 1080p down to 240p, which is the native resolution of the 3DS screens. This may seem pretty drastic, and honestly, it is a big downgrade, but it's important to remember that the 3DS's screens are quite a bit smaller than a normal TV screen, so it's not as bad as it sounds. Similarly to the resolution, the frame rate was also cut from 60 frames per second down to 30 for the original 3DS, although if you have the new 3DS, the one with the colored buttons, then you get the full 60 frames per second as well, which is pretty nifty. Along with the resolution and frame rate downgrades, the lighting and particle effects were lessened in the 3DS version, and the textures are also much less detailed. Some interactions with the environment were also lessened to make the game less graphically demanding. For example, the ground no longer squishes underneath the characters' feet when they walk on it. Obviously, this isn't a huge issue or anything, and it doesn't affect the playability of the game whatsoever, but it is an attention to detail that had to be cut in order to make the game fit on the 3DS. Also, I can't really explain this, but the game just looks more flat to me. I think the screen has a slightly different perspective from the Wii U version, and the backgrounds aren't usually filled with as much detail. This effect is somewhat alleviated by turning up the 3D slider on the 3DS, but if you're playing on a 2DS, you're just stuck with a more flat-looking gameplay screen. Okay, I do want to acknowledge that the vast majority of these graphical downgrades are purely cosmetic. That is, they don't really do anything to impact the general gameplay experience. But there is one graphical downgrade that does have a more profound impact: screen crunch. If you're not familiar with the term, screen crunch basically means that the gameplay screen is effectively zoomed in, so not as much of the level is visible at any given time. This is a pretty common trait of Nintendo's handheld ports. However, unlike most of the other handheld ports, Yoshi's Woolly World's graphics aren't pixel-based, they're 3D model-based. This means that the gameplay area isn't constrained by the pixel count on the screen. As a result, the screen can be zoomed in at variable distances. That sounds a little abstract, so to better visualize this, let's take a look at a couple examples. In more outdoor-themed areas, like Snag Stitch Mountain, the screen crunch seems to be pretty minimal, usually about a 10% effective screen zoom. Meanwhile, in more indoor-themed areas and cave levels such as Sponge Cave Spelunking, the effective screen zoom is closer to 25%. The screen crunch is much more prevalent here, and arguably intrusive. One more thing relating to screen crunch is the fact that the 3DS screen is a different aspect ratio from a standard HD display. More specifically, the 3DS top screen, where the main gameplay takes place, is 800 by 240 pixels, or 15 by 9 aspect ratio, whereas the Wii U's output is 1920 by 1080 pixels, or 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So even if the gameplay screen wasn't zoomed in at all, some of the screen would still be cut off compared to the Wii U version. Now, why is screen crunch such a big deal? Because as a result of not being able to see the entire gameplay screen as originally intended, sometimes platforms, enemies, and, more importantly, collectibles won't be visible to the player as readily as in the Wii U version. This makes it easier to miss jumps, take damage, and miss collectibles by no fault of the player. Now, I will admit that this isn't a factor that completely makes or breaks the game, but it can be pretty frustrating, especially if you're going for 100% completion. Okay, I know this all sounds pretty negative so far, but Poochy in Yoshi's Woolly World isn't just a lesser version of Yoshi's Woolly World. In fact, it has a lot of good things going for it, so let's look at some of the things it added, starting with arguably the biggest addition to this version of the game. Yoshi's Woolly World on the Wii U had Miiverse patches, basically an equivalent of the red coins from Yoshi's Island. Once enough of these were collected, a bunch of Miiverse stamps were unlocked, which the player could use in their Miiverse posts. Of course, Miiverse is no longer with us, so these are useless now. Fortunately, Poochy in Yoshi's Woolly World replaced the Miiverse patches with pencil patches. These also act like the red coins from Yoshi's Island, but instead of unlocking Miiverse stamps, they unlock a selection of patterns that you can use to create your own Yoshi costumes. Yes, Poochy in Yoshi's Woolly World allows you to create your very own custom Yoshis. This is an awesome feature, and probably its most prominent addition. Using the pencil patches that you collect, you can select from up to 78 templates to create a Yoshi with. You can also swap out each template's colors, and you can edit the templates as you see fit. There are infinite possibilities. Of course, if using templates isn't your thing, you can make a fully custom Yoshi costume using the professional mode.
I mean, I don't have an art degree. I'm not sure if I'm qualified to use this.
This mode lets you fully customize each part of Yoshi with any color and any pattern you want. You can only use up to 7 colors for your custom Yoshi design, which is a bit of a bummer. But even still, it's actually a pretty robust tool, with a wide selection of colors to choose from. I made quite a few custom Yoshi costumes with it, with my personal standouts being Nintendo Switch Yoshi, Spyro Yoshi, and yes, even a Donald Trump Yoshi. I mean, why not? It's hilarious!
We're going to build the wall!
And hey, if you want to go old school, you could always make a Yoshi costume with the classic Super Mario World look, including Yoshi's orange arms. Honestly, I had a ton of fun making my own custom Yoshi costumes, and it's gratifying to see your custom Yoshi running through the levels. It's definitely a big selling feature for the 3DS version of Yoshi's Woolly World. Of course, this version is called Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World, and this is where the other big addition comes in. Instead of the minigames from the original version, the 3DS version added Poochy Auto Run levels, where you guide Poochy through a short level to collect gems, find the 3 Poochy pups, and complete a selection of optional level-specific challenges, like popping all of the balloons in the level. These are honestly pretty fun, and I have to say, I actually prefer these over the minigames from the Wii U version. Also, when Yoshi grabs a smiley flower at the end goal of a stage, you unlock a session of Gold Rush. What this means is that for one round of an auto run level, Poochy chases after a golden Lakitu who drops gold gems, which are worth more than regular gems. This is a great way to collect more gems, especially if you use a lot of badges. If you complete all of the challenges in the Poochy auto run levels, you unlock the Golden Poochy costume. Equipping it changes Poochy to be entirely golden anytime he shows up on the screen, including the final cutscene. Hey, that's pretty neat. The last major addition Poochy in Yoshi's Woolly World brings to the table is a bunch of short films involving Yarn Yoshi and Poochy. After you watch one, the game quizzes you on a random aspect of the video, and answering correctly will earn you some gems. These are adorable, and they're a neat addition, but not without faults. You can only unlock one new one every day, and there are 31 of these short films, meaning that if you want to unlock all of them, you'll have to wait for a whole month, or manipulate the 3DS calendar. Honestly, this is a really unfortunate oversight, especially considering Yoshi's Woolly World only takes around 10 to 15 hours to fully complete. In fact, when I first got the 3DS version, I 100% completed it in a single weekend, so it would have been a pain for me to unlock all of the short films. Plus, you can watch all of them on YouTube, which completely negates the need to unlock all of them yourself. Well, that's all the major changes in the 3DS version, but there's quite a few smaller changes too, so let's rapid fire through some of them. The multiplayer mode was removed from the 3DS version. This may be a deal breaker for some, but in my opinion, Yoshi's Woolly World is better going single player anyway, so this isn't a huge deal to me. The original version let you use Amiibo to unlock extra costumes, and the 3DS version adds support for more Amiibo figures, like the Wolf Link Amiibo from The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess HD. The world and level select areas were changed to be linear paths instead of pseudo 3D areas. This is similar to how the Super Mario 3D Land stage select area compares to the more open stage select area of Super Mario 3D World. Finally, the touchscreen acts as a collectible screen. This is great, because it means you can always see what you have and haven't collected so far in the level, instead of having to pause the game to see all of that.
Alright, so that's all the major differences between the two versions of Yoshi's Woolly World. At this point, you could make an informed decision as to which one you should play, but what if you can emulate the games?
Ah, so you're one of those people. It's okay, I've emulated a game or two myself, so I can't pass judgment. And honestly, being able to emulate these kinds of games, legally of course, can be awesome. It opens up a whole world of possibilities, but it does make for an interesting question. Since there really isn't a quote-unquote definitive version of Yoshi's Woolly World, is emulation the better way to experience the game? Well, it's complicated. Yoshi's Woolly World is a fairly recent game on fairly modern hardware, and as such, it's not a super easy game to emulate. You need a decently beefy PC or laptop to get good performance out of either version, and even then the emulation isn't perfect. There's always some weirdnesses that come with emulating games, and these games are no exception. But the type and severity of these weirdnesses differs between the two versions. First, a bit of a disclaimer. I used my desktop PC to emulate these games, which at the time of recording has an AMD Ryzen 5 5600G CPU and an NVIDIA GTX 1060 GPU. What I'm about to describe is my experience using this hardware to emulate Yoshi's Woolly World, and depending on what specs your computer has, you may get different results. Okay, let's start with the Wii U version, which you can emulate using Cemu. There really isn't much benefit here, and there's a decent amount of drawbacks. You can increase the resolution to up to 4K with upscaling, which is awesome if your graphics card can support it, but the game often has stutters and longer loading times between different screens and areas, which only gets worse at higher resolutions. The load times can be slightly improved by using a fast SSD, especially NVMe M.2 SSDs, but even this is often counteracted by the emulation load times regardless of your hardware. That, and sometimes some textures and icons just won't show up. Suffice it to say, I think you get a better experience playing on a real Wii U. The 3DS version is a different story. It actually runs quite well in the Citra emulator, and only experiences minimal stutters and hiccups compared to the Wii U version in Cemu. And unlike the Wii U version, Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World greatly benefits from the upscaling in Citra, especially going from the pitiful 240p to 960p, a whopping 4 times the native resolution. It really does make a big difference, but there's a good number of things that emulating the game just doesn't fix. Most of the graphical downgrades I mentioned earlier are still present when emulating the game, specifically the less detailed textures, lessened lighting and particle effects, an overall more flat look, and screen crunch. I will admit that some of the textures do look better when upscaled, especially the Yoshi model, but most of them just lack the detail level that the Wii U version has, no matter how much you upscale the game. There's even some bad things that upscaling makes more noticeable. In particular, most of the text elements don't get upscaled, and still look like a pixelated mess. This is especially jarring when the rest of the in-game graphics are nicely upscaled. Also, the Yoshi short films are pre-rendered at the 3DS's native resolution of 240p, and upscaling doesn't help these videos whatsoever. Regardless of all the negatives though, upscaling is a great benefit to Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World overall, but there's still more benefits that emulating the game offers. First, you can manipulate how the screens are sized and arranged to your liking. I find that a 4 times upscale with a large top screen is a fantastic combination. Second, you can use whatever controller you want to play the game instead of being limited to just the 3DS controls. This is pretty seamless, as the game rarely uses the 3DS touchscreen or gyroscope. Personally, I like using the Switch Pro controller. At least then I can pretend that I'm playing a Switch version instead of the 3DS version. Long story short, emulating the 3DS version of Yoshi's Woolly World is pretty awesome, and I found that it's a great way to experience the game.
Okay, I think we've covered pretty much everything. Overall, the Wii U version is quite a bit better when it comes to graphical fidelity, but the 3DS version has additional content that just isn't available in the original game. This means that neither version is really a definitive version of the game, and that makes it much more difficult to answer the original question: which version of Yoshi's Woolly World should you play?
Honestly, I think it would have been better to port the game to the Switch instead of the 3DS. Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World came out in early 2017, very close to the Switch's release date. I get that the Switch was still uncertain territory, and the 3DS already had an established install base, but the game feels like it was squished onto the 3DS to me, which obviously isn't ideal. If the graphical downgrades weren't so pronounced in the 3DS version, it would be easier to recommend. And if a Switch version was released that included the extra content of the 3DS version while maintaining or even enhancing the graphical fidelity of the Wii U version, it would be a no-brainer for me to recommend. I will say that a future Switch version of the game is still a possibility, but at the time of this video, it doesn't exist. So for now, here are my recommendations. I think the best and most pure way to experience the game is to play the original Wii U version on a real Wii U. The game looks, sounds, and plays great, and there are none of the graphical issues or hiccups that you would experience emulating the game. In all honesty, the extra content that the 3DS version offers is more cosmetic than anything, and doesn't change the core game much, if at all. But I have to admit, the Poochy auto-running levels, and especially the custom Yoshi costumes, are quite enticing. So if you really want to experience that extra content, I would recommend playing Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World in the Citra emulator at a 3 or 4 times upscaling factor. Despite some minor graphical hiccups, it is, in my view, the closest you can come to the original version's graphical fidelity, while also experiencing the additional content the 3DS version offers.
But either way, I understand that not everyone has a Wii U, a 3DS, and a way to emulate both games, so not everyone has the ability to pick and choose which version of the game they want to play. So I do want to say that even if you only have one option to play Yoshi's Woolly World, I absolutely recommend that you give it a go. This is one of the best Yoshi games, and no matter which version you play, or what hardware you play it on, you're in for a good time. So what do you guys think? Which version of Yoshi's Woolly World would you prefer to play? And if you've already played one version, do you think you'd want to give the other one a try? Let me know in the comments below. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna play the game again using my Super Mario World Yoshi costume. Never gets old.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe so you'll be notified when I make more videos like this. And depending on when you're watching this video, I may be live streaming Poochy and Yoshi's Woolly World. So if you'd like to see the game in action, or would just like to say hello, feel free to tune in. Also, I post updates and chat with the fans in my Discord server, so feel free to join. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.